Iraqi security forces continue a large-scale military operation against al-Qaeda-linked militant groups in the western city of Fallujah. The second Friends of Syria conference kicks off in the Iranian capital in a bid to solve the ongoing crisis in the war-ravaged country. And Iran upgrades its ballistic missiles capable of destroying moving targets with pinpoint precision. Hello, you're watching Al Ittijah World News. I'm Zainab Alawi. The Iraqi army has continued with its full-scale military operation in various cities, namely Fallujah in the western Anbar province, to root out militants belonging to the al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant.
A full-scale military operation is well underway in the Anbar province to root out militants belonging to the al-Qaeda-linked Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. According to military sources, the Iraqi army has engaged in a military operation to clear the remaining areas of Saklawiya, north of the embattled city of Fallujah, from insurgents.
Our troops, including the special forces and pro-government tribesmen, are defeating terrorism in Fallujah. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant militants have been given a scare. They are in a helpless situation. Our forces are nearing the end to military operations there. We have captured several militants and confiscated their weapons and equipment. Soon we will free Fallujah from insurgents.
The source also added that the military offensive is ongoing, with the army regaining control of a road that links Fallujah to Saklawiya.
The military operations have been underway for more than 48 hours and are continuing. The offensive will continue until we root out ISIL militants from Fallujah.
Earlier on Saturday, eyewitnesses stated that clashes erupted between Iraqi soldiers and ISIL militants. With aerial cover, the soldiers tried to enter Fallujah from the Saklawiya area. The operation, however, was confronted by militants, with clashes ensuing for 3 hours. A tribal leader who witnessed the attack said there were a number of deaths and injuries from both sides, as well as civilian casualties. The latest unrest comes after security forces pressed on with an unsuccessful assault on the city. Security forces have shelled the ISIL stronghold of Fallujah west of the capital, Baghdad, repeatedly for months. The Anbar province has been plagued by violence since December, when the army removed an anti-government protest camp in the provincial capital of Ramadi. Authorities said the camp was used as headquarters for the leadership of al-Qaeda. The bloodshed later spread to the nearby city of Fallujah. Violence in Ramadi has largely been subdued, while Fallujah remains completely out of government control after being overrun in January by militants from the ISIL. The army barricaded the city in response and has since been delaying the assault to avoid any civilian casualties. Now the full-scale military operation is underway in a bid to quell al-Qaeda-linked fighters and hostile tribesmen, whose insurgence has killed hundreds of civilians, forced nearly 400,000 people to flee their homes, and inflicted severe damage on infrastructure.
Official figures released by the United Nations revealed that violence in Iraq claimed more than 900 lives last month. According to the UN's mission to Iraq, at least 799 Iraqis were killed in acts of terrorism and other violence, while a further 195 died as a result of military operations in the conflict-hit province of Anbar in the west of the country. Now, figures released by the Iraqi ministries, meanwhile, put the toll at 938 killed, including 804 civilians, while the number of injured stands at 1,463. Well, Iraq's Deputy Prime Minister Hussein al-Shahristani has said that Turkey was driven by greed when it shipped oil from the northern Kurdistan region to international markets. The former oil minister's comment marks an escalation of rhetoric amid a row between Baghdad on the one hand and Ankara and Arbil on the other over last month's oil sale. Iraq's central government insists that exporting crude oil is its prerogative and has even taken legal action against its neighbor for illegally transporting its natural resources.
Turkey has been driven by greed to try to lay hands on cheap Iraqi oil. They have facilitated this smuggling, and obviously this has undermined the relationship between the two important neighbors.
The second Friends of Syria conference has kicked off in the Iranian capital Tehran to tackle the latest developments in Syria and find a peaceful solution to the 3-year-long crisis that has afflicted the country. Our Tehran correspondent Hussein Dabash with the details.
As part of an ongoing campaign by the Islamic Republic to try and solve the crisis in Syria, the second parliamentary meeting of the Friends of Syria kicked off in the Iranian capital Tehran. Parliamentary delegations from 30 countries, including heads of foreign policy commissions in Mexico, Russia, Syria, Iraq, and Zimbabwe, are taking part in the event. Iranian officials, including Parliament Speaker Ali Larijani and Mohammad Javad Zarif, the country's foreign minister, were also present. Zarif called on the international community to stop supporting those who are causing havoc in Syria, adding that the group will not stop until the country is destroyed.
The crisis in Syria has entered its 4th year. The humanitarian crisis and catastrophe happening in Syria is because of interference of some people and governments trying to settle some scores on the ground. This has nothing to do with Syria, and because of this, the process of political reform has been disrupted. These people causing the chaos in Syria will not stop at Syria. In fact, they will one day be at the throats of their financiers and their supporters.
Among others present at the meeting included the chairman of the Iranian Parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Commission, Alauddin Borujerdi, who made clear the main objectives of the conference.
The West is supporting people on the ground in Syria that are decapitating whoever comes in their way. Tens of thousands of people have died because of this support. All the delegates here want a peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria. We are discussing the end of the Syrian crisis. With the developments that are happening on the ground, which are in favor of a peaceful solution, I think that this meeting, which is an alternative to the type of solution that the West has in mind, is the only solution that will work. Those countries who are supporting the arms flow into Syria and the militants there will fail to achieve their goals.
Delegates at the meeting did not differ in their stance on Syria. They gave us their views on the challenges they face when it comes to solving the crisis in the war-ravaged country.
The challenges are obvious. Regional and Western governments are destroying Syria through proxies on the ground. Now the delegates here are all friends of Syria. They are the real friends of Syria, the people you see here, because they want a solid solution, a peaceful one to the crisis in Syria. The Western-backed so-called Friends of Syria have nothing to do with Syria. They do not recognize the wants and needs of the Syrian people. They focus their meetings and their benefits and what they want for themselves out of the crisis in Syria.
We are here because we are trying to do whatever we can to search for a solution in Syria, not only as a country but for all the people. It is not only about which table you are or which people are you meeting with. In this case, I believe it is important because there is a lot of countries that are close to the reality in Syria. So I believe that we can find a very good approach here.
Tehran believes that the growing number of countries taking part in such meetings indicates that Iran's policy on the Syrian crisis has become popular, as Western policies to arm and train opposition groups is losing both credibility and consensus. This is the second such meeting on Syria hosted by Iran's parliament since the beginning of the year and is part of a wider campaign by the Islamic Republic to put an end to the crisis in the strife-ridden nation. Members of delegations present here believe that the presidential election process, which is set to kick off in Syria in 2 days, is part of a peaceful solution that can end the crisis there. All guests present here today have voiced support for this election process in Syria and also finding a peaceful solution that can end the over 3-year-old crisis there. Reporting for AEE TV, Hussein Dabash, Tehran.
A senior Iranian military commander has announced that the Islamic Republic has upgraded its ballistic missiles, which will now be able to hit moving targets with pinpoint precision. Now, Islamic Revolution Guards Corps Brigadier General Hossein Salami said that in addition to Iran, only Russia is likely to possess this technology. He also added that the military has improved its air defense system. Tehran has always stressed that its military capabilities pose no threat to other countries and are based on a deterrence strategy. A new campaign launched by foreign-backed militant groups is underway in Syria's Aleppo, where a wave of mortar shells are being used to target civilians, causing massive material damage as government forces repelled the ground attacks, killing and injuring scores.
Syria's once commercial hub Aleppo is under militant fire yet again, and as usual it has been targeted by mortar rounds, the militants' weapon of choice, killing more than 15 civilians yesterday and wounding at least 100. A source at Aleppo Police Command said that terrorist groups targeted the neighborhoods of Al-Maidan, Al-Khalidiyya, Al-Abara and Sadal al-Jabari Square in the city with mortar shells. Meanwhile, Syria's Air Force targeted militant-held areas, and the source of attacks reportedly killed and injured several gunmen. Activists have reported that phone lines have been cut off as a result of the militants' attack on parts of the city. But mortar fire was not exclusive to the city of Aleppo, as it claimed the lives of 2 citizens, including a 4-year-old child, and injured 13 others in the Noon camp in Al-Kiswe area in the Damascus countryside. Elsewhere in the strife-torn country, Syrian army units warded off an attack by militant groups and asserted control over Al-Taf and Satah Zahnan towns in Al-Lajat area in Daraa countryside, after eliminating a number of gunmen and destroying their equipment. A military source told Sana that an army unit foiled militants' attempt to attack a military checkpoint in Dar al-Balam, killing and injuring a number of gunmen. Amid the preparations for the country's first multi-candidate presidential elections, it appears as though the relentless campaign by militant groups to sow mayhem across the country has intensified, as they have vowed to do whatever it takes to hold the democratic process in Syria.
With just 2 days left to the historic presidential poll in Syria, the country's higher judicial committee for elections has completed all preparations to host the first multi-candidate elections. Syrian people will go to the polls on June 3rd to choose their president amid violence that has ravaged their country for more than 3 years. Over 160,000 people have reportedly been killed and millions displaced due to the violence fueled by the foreign-backed militants. Well, let's get our senior correspondent in Syria, Hussein Al-Musawi, with us for more. Hussein, are Syrians prepared to head to the polls in the coming days?
Yes, as I spoke to Syrians today, they seem very determined and very defiant. They are preparing themselves to go to the polling stations, which are due to be held on June 3rd. In 2 days' time. Yes, they are prepared. This is if I can say, the first presidential multi-candidate elections to be held in more than 50 years. So Syrians feel that they are part of this democratic process. They want their voices to be heard. They also hope that after they attend the polling stations and after they be part of this democratic process, that their demands will be achieved. Their main demands now is really security and better life quality, as well as education and an end to corruption. So yes, we will see as I spoke to Syrians, as they told me today, we will see a historic turnout in these elections. People are really waiting for it. I was on the streets of Damascus today, and I was able to see the campaigns, pictures of Dr. Bashar al-Assad as well as the other 2 candidates, and also the decoration on the cars, on the buildings. I mean, Damascus and Syria as a whole, it's all decorated with campaigns. People are hoping and they are very happy that these elections are gonna occur, and they want to be part of this democratic process because they know that their voices will hopefully end the crisis in Syria and ultimately achieve peace in the war-torn country.
And will polling stations be closed in certain troubled areas like Al Raqqa, for example? Will we see voting in those areas, or will the polling stations there be closed due to security reasons?
Well, for starters, yes. The city of Raqqa, there will be no elections in that city. As I was told, that no elections will be held in that city as a whole. However, other areas which are under government controlled areas, yes, there will be elections. So we know that Damascus, parts of Aleppo, as well as Homs, there will be elections. As well, further to the south, in some parts of Dar'a as well. We know that the main city center of these areas, there will be held elections. However, other areas such as you mentioned, Raqqa, and areas which are on the suburbs of Damascus, no elections will be held because, and the Syrian government announced this a week ago. They said that approximately 4 to 5 million people will not take part in these elections because those areas are under militant control. So what we know now, that the capital, all Damascus residents will head to the polls. Most of Aleppo will head to the polls. Most of Homs will head to the polls, and other regions as well. However, there are parts of people are saying, I spoke to someone, he told me today, around 30% of the Syrian population, or 25%, will not take part. And the government really gave them that chance. They told them, you can move into our areas and you can take part in this historic poll. However, if you decide to stay in your areas, therefore you will not be able to take part in this historic event. So it really comes back to those people. They don't want to be part of this democratic process.
Yes, and we will be waiting for that historic event there, for those elections, to see how developments unfold in Syria. Hussein Al-Musawi there, our senior correspondent in Syria. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, in other news, in a fresh round of violence, Turkish police fired tear gas and water cannon at hundreds of people in Istanbul and Ankara, as demonstrations marking a year since deadly anti-government protests erupted.
1 year on, the ghost of Gezi continues to hover over Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan. With memories of last year's Taksim Square violence fresh in people's minds, hundreds of protesters took to the streets of the Turkish capital Ankara, as well as the city of Istanbul. Just a day after violent clashes on the one-year anniversary of the country's largest anti-government demonstrations in decades, protests swelled into an outpouring of anger against the supposed authoritarian tendencies of the government. Riot police fired tear gas and water cannon at hundreds in Ankara, but protesters remained defiant.
This is only the beginning. We will keep on fighting. The protests may have been quelled today, but the discontent is still there and will spread. Erdogan might have won votes in the ballot box now, but this is not a sustainable strategy. You cannot win a war against your own people.
The forces had stepped in to disperse around 500 people from downtown Kizilay Square, who attempted to stage a demonstration where a 26-year-old protester was shot and killed by police the same day last year. Ethem Sarisuluk was one of at least 8 people killed and thousands injured as clouds of tear gas wafted through the park on Taksim Square, following an outpouring of anger against Erdogan and the violent police crackdown against the demonstrators. Last year's protests, which started as a small campaign to save Istanbul's Gezi Park from redevelopment, eventually drew an estimated 3 million protesters. The heavy-handed crackdown earned Ankara strong rebuke from the Council of Europe, which in a statement condemned the excessive use of force by the Turkish police against demonstrators and journalists. Turkey has seen a year of turmoil and instability, from a corruption scandal to a mining disaster. And with fresh demonstrations 1 year on, one thing is for sure: the events of Taksim Square seem to be a long way from being forgotten.
Well, to get some more analysis on this, we are joined by Cengiz Aktan, a political analyst. What does the number of police and security forces deployed around Istanbul's Taksim Square to prevent these rallies say about the level of concern in the Turkish government?
Well, I mean, I think what happened last year represents a major opposition and challenge to the otherwise uncontested power of Prime Minister Erdogan. And he was ready. He was eager to impede and to put obstacles on any sort of commemorations yesterday. And he literally deployed an army. There were 25,000 policemen in the streets in and around the square, and 50 anti-riot vehicles. I mean, it was like a city center under siege.
And is it really necessary to have this heavy-handed crackdown? I mean, isn't there some sort of diplomatic solution to this?
Well, Mr. Prime Minister wants to become president in August, and then he wants to change the regime to a presidential system. I mean, it was officially announced by a deputy chairman of his party, and Turkey, with this sort of ukaz, with this sort of memorandum to the entire country and to the world, we might still have tough times ahead.
But how much political damage will this cause the three-time premier?
Well, I mean, just to give you a first-hand information about the future, how it may evolve. Today there were two by-elections because the ruling party contested the results of the local elections in two towns, one in the east, one in the west of the country, and both elections were for mayorship were won by the opposition. So I think not everything is going in the direction that the prime minister would like to, and we might have more tension, polarization, and clashes in the months to come, I'm afraid.
So we will be seeing these protests more and more. This will be a recurring feature in the run-up to the August presidential elections?
I mean, it's not impossible. It's not impossible, although, as we have seen in the deployment of the police yesterday, and also today, by the way, the government is really heavy-handed, to make sure that no one will go in the streets, and it was impossible actually to go and even buy food, it was in this area. So I mean, they think, and this is how they will control the society. I think it's no avail. I think we will have therefore, I mean, they will have to increase the number of police officers in the streets. That's the only way they may manage to control the country. But I mean, of course, this is not how the country should evolve in the 21st century as a democratic and decent society.
Political analyst there, Mr. Cengiz Aktin, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Bye-bye.
Well, stay with us here on Al Ittijah World News. Still to come. U.S. soldier freed in Taliban prisoner swap deal. Welcome back. Our top stories are: Iraqi security forces continue a large-scale military operation against Al-Qaeda-linked militant groups in the western city of Fallujah. The second Friends of Syria conference kicks off in the Iranian capital in a bid to solve the ongoing crisis in the war-ravaged country. And Iran upgrades its ballistic missiles capable of destroying moving targets with pinpoint precision. Kuwait's Amir Sheikh Sabah Al Ahmed Al Sabah has arrived in the Iranian capital Tehran for a landmark visit expected to focus on mending ties between Iran and the Gulf states. Kuwaiti officials said the visit will focus on controversial regional issues, including the crisis in Syria, the situation in Iraq, Egypt, and the so-called Middle East peace process. Relations between Iran and the Gulf, namely signs of rapprochement between regional power broker Saudi Arabia, will also be on the agenda during the visit. Well, moving on to some other news now, Bahrain's main opposition parties announced their boycott of next month's parliamentary elections, vowing no political participation unless full-scale reforms are implemented by the country's ruling monarchy. The comments were made during a press conference which included all parties opposed to the Bahraini regime. The statement further highlighted that any political participation on the part of the opposition would take place only after radical reforms are introduced, including the authorization of peaceful protests and the release of all political prisoners. The opposition also said that the Bahraini people should be the only source of authority.
We have realized that from 2011 until now, the regime has rejected reforms and therefore we must not participate in the upcoming elections. If the government carries out reforms, we will change our position. The opposition will not boycott the election, but all practices with this dictatorship. The boycott will be translated through the means of a civil and peaceful resistance.
Well, joining us to discuss this further is head of the Al-Wifaq's Department of Human Rights, Mr. Hadi Al-Musawi. Mr. Al-Musawi, good to have you with us today. So what does Al-Wifaq hope to achieve by boycotting next month's parliamentary elections?
The situation in Bahrain today, that there is a decision being taken by the authorities and the opposition need to have their own decision as well. So the opposition put their paper on the table saying that we will boycott the election or coming election because nothing being changed, no political process accepted by the authority. The human rights situation is getting worse and worse. The authority are not taking any tangible or let's say seen action which encouraging the opposition to think positively. The problem that getting in this election is encouraging the authority to stay as deep in dictatorship.
And why is this? Why is the Bahraini regime persistent on their stance against these anti-government protesters?
Believe me that we are living in a very, let's say, Bedouin region. We are among 6 countries like the GCC countries. They are not looking forward to respect their people, but to respect the ruling families instead. The problem that when we call for democracy, for example, they said, yes, we do have our democracy, but according to our understand, according to our belief, our majlis or our halls are open for everybody. And this is not the democracy that the people are looking for. We are looking really for a real democracy and a genuine democracy, that one man, one vote, everybody can participate in political process, everybody can equalize with anyone, either from royal family or from even abroad, even expats. We would like them to feel as a human in our country. This is the problem between the opposition and the ruling family in Bahrain. The other hand, that if the authority will accept this kind of demands, that means they will open a very wide door for all other societies in Gulf region. They may demand the same. So that's why they try to ignore all our brightened and enlightened views.
Okay, and Al-Wifaq said that they would participate in these elections if the government offered reforms. If you could just give us some idea about what these reforms are that the opposition is talking about.
To be honest, myself, I participate in this parliament. When we were there, we couldn't change anything. Even if we suggest any law, for example, there is a Supreme Council, which is, they call it Shura Council. And we represent the people, but we have nothing in our hand to do. So there is no reforms, and we have more than 2,000 prisoners in jail, and lots of them are conscious prisoners, like the leaders, Ustad Hassan Mshemi, Ustad Abdul Wahab Hussein, Dr. Abdul Jalil Al-Singais, Abdul Hadi Al-Khwaja, lots of them being put in behind the bar because of their opinion, because of their point of view towards the politics policy. So if they changed, and if they did not prove that they are intent to change their mentality, their policy, there is no mean to get again to the same sustained situation.
And the opposition's decision to boycott these elections, how do you think this move will be perceived by the Bahraini regime?
Keeping the situation as it is, we believe, is better than giving the authority a credit, saying that everything is well and nice and fine in Bahrain. If we get to this process and we shared, or let's say we went to the election, the people will not attend to put their votes. So we are a part of the people. We are not against the people. So we believe that if we decide to go with the authority, we will shine their picture. We will say in a meaning or another that there is no problem in Bahrain, and we are not going to say this. We are emphasize saying we have a big problem in Bahrain, and this problem needs to be solved by a political decision by the authority.
And how far do you think the Al Khalifa regime is willing to go with this, ignoring these demonstrations on the one hand and their brutal crackdown on the demonstrators on the other?
The authority is always trying to use the public relation, let's say, campaigns. They try to challenge the situation by saying, yes, we have an Arabic court for human rights. We have religious dialogue. We have even dialogue with the opposition. Although these all are fake actions. This is not true. They would like to put, let's say, to create a nice picture in front of the global observers, saying Bahrain is very well country, very nice country, everything is nice here. That's why they try to tighten and put the opposition in a very tight corner. While we are not going to give up, we will stay raising our voice, calling for a democracy, calling for our freedom, and calling for all our prisoners' freedom, and change our situation politically, economically, socially, and human rights. Everything we will not give up, but we will stay and sustain achieving our goals.
Yes, well, it was a pleasure to have you with us today, Mr. Hadi Al-Musawi, there, head of the Al Wifaq's Department of Human Rights. At the start of his weekly cabinet meeting in occupied Al-Quds, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called on the international community to not recognize a Palestinian unity government, which includes Hamas, due to be announced on June 2nd.
I call on all the responsible elements in the international community not to hurry and recognize a Palestinian government which includes Hamas, or leaning on Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization which calls for the destruction of Israel, and the international community must not embrace it. This will not strengthen peace, it will strengthen terror.
Palestinian and Israeli NGOs have written to the EU demanding immediate action for Palestinian detainees on a long-term hunger strike in Israeli jails, as the Zionist regime continues with its harsh crackdown and treatment of Palestinians.
Palestinians, as well as Israeli NGOs, are now increasingly voicing their calls for the rights and liberties of Palestinians. As the overall number of Palestinian detainees on mass hunger strike climbed to 290, rights groups took it upon themselves to send a letter to EU Foreign Policy Chief Catherine Ashton, demanding urgent intervention on behalf of the long-term hunger strikers, with 70 currently being treated in hospitals. The letter, signed by 17 rights groups and the Palestinian Detainees Affairs Ministry, stated the situation has reached a critical stage and warned of dire consequences for the health of all those on strike unless there is immediate action. Scores of people took to the streets of the West Bank and Gaza over the weekend, also expressing their support for the hunger strikers and protesting against their detention without trial. Family members and rights activists joined sit-in tents and campaigns to bring attention to their plight. In Gaza City, supporters and relatives of the detainees called upon the international community to denounce and act against the Israeli entity and its rights violations.
We have been here, relatives and supporters, at this sit-in, tent on hunger strike for 5 days, in support with our sons, the detainees who are under administrative detention in the Israeli occupation jails.
We, the members of the resistance movements, assure the prisoners that we will never forget them. The resistance movements should activate their power to stop this Zionist aggression against them. We try through continuous events to deliver the voice of the prisoners to the world.
As is usually the case, it didn't take long before Israeli occupation forces attacked the peaceful demonstrators. Zionist soldiers clashed with Palestinian youth, using tear gas and stun grenades to disperse the crowd at the El Arub refugee camp. In all, there are more than 5,000 Palestinians stripped of their basic human rights in Israeli jails. Many have witnessed firsthand that hunger striking is the most effective practice that detainees can use to secure their freedom, as was the case with Samir al-Isawi, who was released from an Israeli prison after an 8-month hunger strike.
U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel staunchly defended the prisoner exchange to free U.S. Army Sergeant Bergdahl as an effort to save his life, adding that it could provide a breakthrough for peace in Afghanistan. Bergdahl, the only U.S. soldier captured by the Taliban since the war began in 2001, was freed in exchange for 5 senior Taliban detainees, as both parties claimed success for the dramatic deal brokered by Qatar. But the swap was criticized by several Republican lawmakers who demanded to know whether the Taliban prisoners would return to fight the United States.
Well, first of all, we didn't negotiate with terrorists. As I said and explained it before, Sergeant Bergdahl is a prisoner of war. That's a normal process in getting your prisoners back. That's first. Second, as to your bigger question, we are dealing with terrorism and hostage taking all the time, everywhere. I think America's record is pretty clear on going after terrorists, especially those who take hostages. And I don't think what we did in getting our prisoner of war released in any way would somehow encourage terrorists to take our American servicemen prisoner or hostage. As you know, we have strongly supported an Afghan-led effort to come to an agreement with the Taliban. As you know, we had engaged with the Taliban up until 2012. They broke off those negotiations. We've had no formal relationship since then. So maybe this will be a new opening that can produce an agreement.
China has struck back firmly at Japan and the U.S., accusing the two countries of attempting to sow controversy and division in the Asia-Pacific region.
China on Sunday strongly condemned Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and U.S. Defense Chief Chuck Hagel for making, quote, provocative remarks against Beijing.
The Chinese delegation have this feeling that the speeches of Mr. Abe and Mr. Hagel are a provocative action against China.
Diverting from his prepared remarks, Wang told a top Asian Security Forum in Singapore that the speeches of the top US and Japanese officials were unacceptable. He accused Abe, who spoke on Friday, and Hagel, who delivered his speech on Saturday, of coordinating and encouraging each other to attack China in their remarks.
This is simply unimaginable. The speeches made by Mr. Abe and Mr. Hagel gave me the impression that they coordinated with each other, they supported each other, they encouraged each other, and they took the advantage of speaking first and staged provocative actions and challenges against China.
US Defense Secretary Hagel on Saturday had warned China against, quote, destabilizing actions in the South China Sea and detailed a list of such infractions.
But in recent months, China has undertaken destabilizing unilateral actions asserting its claims in the South China Sea.
Hagel was referring to the way China has claimed territorial rights over areas of the South China Sea close to Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam. Abe, who opened the forum on Friday, urged countries to respect the law in apparent reference to China's aggressive moves in the South and East China Seas. Although the territorial disputes have overshadowed relations between the Asian states for decades, the recent spike in tensions can only be attributed to the increased US involvement in the crisis, as Washington continues its so-called Pacific shift in an effort to confine a rapidly growing China.
Only a part of the recent NBC interview with former intelligence contractor Edward Snowden was actually aired. However, excerpts have now been posted online showing that the network neglected to air critical statements about the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
You know, and this is a key question that the 9/11 Commission considered. And what they found in the postmortem, when they looked at all of the classified intelligence from all of the different intelligence agencies, they found that we had all of the information we needed as an intelligence community, as a classified sector, as the national defense of the United States, to detect this plot. We actually had records of the phone calls from the United States and out. The CIA knew who these guys were. The problem was not that we weren't collecting information. It wasn't that we didn't have enough dots. It wasn't that we didn't have a haystack. It was that we did not understand the haystack that we have. If we're missing things, like the Boston Marathon bombings, where all of these mass surveillance systems, every domestic dragnet in the world, didn't reveal guys that the Russian intelligence service told us about by name. Is that really the best way to protect our country? Or are we trying to throw money at a magic solution that's actually not just costing us our safety, but our rights and our way of life?
Thailand's junta has deployed thousands of troops across the capital Bangkok in response to calls made on social media outlets that urged anti-coup protesters to take to the streets and decry what is being dubbed as authoritarianism exercised by the military.
Upon hearing that a mass rally was planned in the Thai capital Bangkok, 6,000 police officers and army soldiers were instantly put on alert to prevent any potential gatherings. Backed by armored vehicles, army soldiers were placed on high alert. Protesters, however, failed to live up to calls for a nationwide demonstration. Only a couple of hundred people bothered to make the trip down to the city center, where they brandished their banners and shouted anti-coup slogans shortly before being confronted by security forces. Several protesters were reportedly arrested as the march was dispersed. The commercial area, meanwhile, was almost completely deserted. Only security personnel could be seen blocking off traffic. Transport was suspended, and shopping malls were also closed.
We will check everybody to prevent the protesters coming into the area. The skywalk above is also closed, and we're not allowing anyone to commute until the situation is resolved.
7 other locations were also sealed off across the capital. Junta leaders claim they want to ensure nothing affects peace and security. According to a security plan announced earlier, an assembly of more than 4 people is prevented, a move which for many is taking its toll on their daily lives. I heard they will block the road. It is really affecting the people who work around here. I work at Central World Shopping Mall. It can only open half day from 2 p.m. It is affecting my daily routine. The lingering political impasse in the Southeast Asian nation is set to last for some time. The military says political reforms will take up to 15 months to be implemented, ruling out any elections before a year and sparking further fury from those who want a new government installed to end 8 years of corruption.
And now let's take a look at some other interesting news from around the world.
To be or not to be. Shakespeare's renowned existential dilemma is now at the heart of the Syrian conflict. Around 60 young actors from the Zaatari refugee camp are encoring their performance of King Lear and Hamlet at the historic Roman amphitheater in Jordan's Amman. A road trip turned archaeology discovery has proven that children should be taken more seriously. Students on an expedition have stumbled upon a pre-Hispanic mummy that could be as old as 7,000 years in northern Chile, and it was no figment of their imagination. North Korea marked International Children's Day in Pyongyang with music, games, and dance performances among a crowd of official and foreign guests. Pandas apparently aren't just giant in stature, but also in revenue. An 11-month-old Taiwan-born cub has generated well over $17 million since its birth. It was a busy day for firefighters in China, where 2 boys were pulled out of an 8-meter-long asphalt tank. The children had been playing near the tank when they both fell. Old habits die hard, but the 44 million smokers in Russia will have to break their unhealthy routine, as the country has extended a ban on smoking to restaurants.
A reminder of our top stories. Iraqi security forces continue a large-scale military operation against al-Qaeda-linked militant groups in the western city of Fallujah. The second Friends of Syria conference kicks off in the Iranian capital in a bid to solve the ongoing crisis in the war-ravaged country. And Iran upgrades its ballistic missiles capable of destroying moving targets with pinpoint precision. That's it for today. Have a good night.